Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Dear participants, this is the first webinar of 2021 of the Global Solar Council, organized in association with the Worldwide Carbon Prize. This is also the launching event of the Worldwide Carbon Prize initiative that will be presented after my introduction. Carbon pricing as a win-win solution for a green recovery. This is the title of the webinar today. We are living the worst economic crisis ever. The last time we saw such a crisis, maybe even not so big, was the Second World War. And the pandemic is still there, is not totally over, even if we see the light thanks to the vaccine. Governments are facing two main challenges. On one side, the green recovery plans need to become a reality through a set of policies that will distribute a huge amount of clean energy investments that we have never seen in our economies. But on the other side, public finances has been severely stretched by emergency measures during the pandemic and limiting options to raise new funds. So what is the real context of these green measures in this moment? In most countries, tax cannot be raised further to repay the recovery. On the contrary, tax should be reduced in such a difficult moment. The actual fiscal systems are not thought to support the environmental and climate objectives that we have and need to be totally redesigned. Many countries are still giving subsidies to fossil fuels that are contributing to significant environmental and climate damage. We really urgently need an exit strategy, not a transition, but an exit strategy from the fossil fuel, even if we need to take into consideration a just transition approach. We, of course, need to take into consideration the social aspect, jobs, and anyway, a real an approach that look at these social aspects. Renewables like solar are very cheap, very competitive, but the stop of activities in the pandemic has temporarily induced fossil fuel to go to the market with very low prices, threatening the already unfair competition that do not take into account the cost of the emissions. But we know that the fossil fuel prices are volatile and we cannot trust them. So putting a global price on carbon emissions presents a unique solution for overcoming post-pandemic fiscal stress and boosting the transition to green technologies. Carbon pricing should have a zero net impact on overall tax revenues, but provide an economic incentive for people and companies keen to shift to more sustainable practice, for example, by investing in solar and other renewable energy sources. We cannot talk about one policy. We need to talk about policies, carbon pricing policies that are tailored on the context of each country. But of course, we need a global approach. We need a global approach that ensure harmonization of these policies and avoid unfair competitiveness. So in this webinar, we aim to reach three points. Mainly explain why this is a perfect time to expand the carbon pricing in the world, examine how it works, and explore the benefit to fiscal regimes, trade, investment, and climate policies. So we start with the presentation of the first speaker, Attilio Piattelli, who is a Vice President and Secretary General of Worldwide Carbon Prize, and that I have the honor to chair. And Attilio will explain more about the global initiative, and I will complement the beginning of the presentation. Attilio, please, the floor is yours. Can you show the presentation? Maybe I will highlight some few slides at the beginning of why we are launching this initiative, because Global Solar Council is one of the founder of this initiative, and as many other associations, and not only industry association, but also environmental association. Attilio, if you want to share the screen, we can.
Hey, thank you, Gianni. Can you see the screen?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Do you want to go on?
Yes, just a few words about anyway why worldwide carbon price has been created. Anyway, our goal is to adopt carbon price policies at global level. So this mechanism need a global approach. And can you move on, please? And this is very easy to apply. Carbon pricing mechanism for sure help in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we cannot say this is the only solution, but for sure the complete decarbonization by 2050 cannot be reached without carbon price mechanism globally. Next, please. And anyway, very important to highlight the principles in here. The prices we pay for the vast majority of the services we use and the goods we buy don't reflect the cost of carbon emissions generated. Carbon emissions no borders, and have to have the same impact everywhere and in the world. That's why it's needed a global approach. So we need to put a carbon price in order to, it is the right moment to introduce carbon price policies. So Attilio, the floor is yours, and yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Gianni. Good afternoon, everybody. So can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, fine, thank you. Yeah, my presentation is going to be divided into parts. I'm trying to be very quick. The first one, I want to just explain the organization of the initiative, so worldwide carbon price, the organization, how it works, and the second part, I would try to give some idea about the position of the associations with regards to the decarbonization policies. So starting from how the association works, I can say that Worldwide Carbon Price is a non-profit association based in Brussels. It was born last year. Can become members just associations, institutions, public bodies, foundations, and research bodies, and cannot become members private companies or individual people. No member fee is required, and this has been done just to facilitate joining the association. Has been a decision made just to really facilitate the joining the association. As I said, companies and individual people cannot become members, but they can participate in the promotion of the association, and they can participate becoming supporters by paying an annual fee or just a one-off contribution. For one-off contribution, it could be a sponsorship, for example, for our initiatives, webinars, and so on. Then all companies can become supporters, because will be not accepted the companies that have the aims contrary to the association, and or if they pursue ethical or non-peaceful purposes. And this is for sure is very important. So for example, I can say that will not be accepted donation from companies involved in the extraction, transformation, or processing of fossil fuel, but that is just an example. There will be other activities that are forbidden and are in the statute of the association. In what we do, we are focusing our action on 3 groups of stakeholders. The first one is represented by institutions and international organizations, and the activity we try to do is for sure lobbying and trying to convince institutions, governments to adopt carbon price policies. The second group of stakeholders is the association and foundation, and for sure we try to ask them to join the initiative, and also promoting the initiative through the institutions of the countries. And the third one, as I said, is represented by companies and individual people that can support the association, mainly helping to finance with fee, but also promoting the association. For sure, we have a steering committee, but we also have a scientific committee, and it's an advisory body and is appointed by the steering committee. The members are experts on climate change and on carbon price policy. And what I can say is that the scientific committee is in charge for just to propose carbon pricing policies, and also to suggest methods and timing for the implementation of these proposals. So I would like just to take the chance to thank the members of the scientific committee that I'm sure are participating to the webinar, and also to thank the association that have decided to join the initiative. So moving to the position of the association with regards to decarbonization policies, we are working on carbon pricing, carbon credits, and environmentally harmful subsidies. With regards to carbon pricing, the idea of worldwide carbon price is that the carbon tax should progressively be introduced in all sectors which are not covered by emission trading systems. And the idea is just because in this way we will be able to cover as much as possible the emissions. Then any carbon price mechanism should be implemented at zero net additional overall tax revenues, and this has been already told by you, Gianni. And carbon mechanism should be also used together with other measures, just to involve people and try to convince them to change behaviors. Carbon pricing mechanism should also be introduced as homogeneous as possible between countries, just not to have differences. And common frameworks and exchange of experience between countries is recommended. About carbon pricing in terms of carbon border adjustment mechanism, we think that countries or regions with a carbon price mechanism already in place should design and introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is in order to induce other countries to introduce carbon price policies. We also think that voluntary agreements with companies or industry with low emission, but that are located in third countries where a carbon price mechanism is not in place should be possible. And this is because we don't want to penalize these kind of companies that have low emissions. And on the other hand, a common standard for carbon content of traded goods is recommended between countries, just to speak the same word, you know. Then about just a few words about ETS in Europe, and this is because as we know, ETS in Europe is the biggest system we have in the world at present, and is under discussion the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe. And our idea is that as soon as this will be in place, ETS should progressively phase out allocation of free allowances or credits, just to balance the introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanism. Then carbon credits. We are convinced that the international market for carbon credits should be pushed, and carbon credit could be used to finance carbon sink projects, new technologies, and also engage public and voluntary on a voluntary basis. Last but not less important is to work for the reduction or the elimination, the phase out of environmental harmful subsidies. And this is fundamental, and it should be done everywhere around the world and as soon as possible. And the revenues coming from the phase out of these subsidies for sure need to be used for the support of companies and for the support of investment in low carbon technologies. This is very, very briefly what we do and what we think. And yes, I want to thank everybody, and just want to say that if everybody is interested, can give a look to the website www.worldwidecarbonprice.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attilio, for this comprehensive introduction of the Worldwide Carbon Price Initiative and anyways, association. Of course, our goal is to have a different point of view anyway and debate within the association and evolve anyway in our message that we want to bring then in the COP26. So we continue with the next speaker. We have the pleasure to have with us anyway a very high-level expert on carbon pricing, Professor Paul Ekins, Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy and Director, UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, University College London. And Professor Ekins will talk about carbon pricing, will give an overview of carbon pricing for a solar revolution, for anyway, solar and renewables as well, of course, all the sector. And Professor Ekins, the floor is yours and for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gianni, and I'm looking forward to sharing this presentation with you. So, carbon pricing is a win-win solution for a green recovery. I think pretty well anyone listening to this will know the basic rationale for carbon pricing. I'm an economist, and you will have noticed that economists tend to have many different views about many different things, but carbon pricing is one thing that practically every economist agrees on, that it needs to be introduced because there is a colossal market failure leading to excessive pollution and environmental destruction. The British economist Nick Stern called it the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. It's more efficient than regulation in the sense that it enables companies who are involved in carbon pricing, it enables them all to arrive at the same abatement cost, at the least cost across the economy. It's more effective than voluntary agreements and information, and there's lots of analysis of that. It, without significant increases in carbon-based energy prices, then energy consumption and carbon emissions will go on rising, and energy efficiency will effectively be disincentivized. And this will lead to increased carbon emissions and a failure to stabilize the climate in a cost-effective way. And as I say, I think there's very broad agreement among the economics community about that. If we look, carbon pricing is already implemented around the world. This is quite a complicated picture from the World Bank, and I don't have time to explain all the different colors and shadings to you. But basically, it's where carbon prices or emission trading schemes have been implemented or will be implemented or are being implemented around the world. And in a way, it's quite a hopeful picture because it shows that the idea of global carbon pricing is by no means a complete moonshot. It is already underway in many countries. However, and this is the bad news, and this is a diagram we produced for the Lancet Countdown on Global Health and Climate Change, published in the journal Lancet last year. Gianni mentioned, and so did Attilio, the whole business of environmentally harmful subsidies. And when you take those into account, you find that actually the net carbon price globally is negative. So not only are we not pricing carbon, we are actually on a global basis subsidizing carbon. And you can't persuade me as an economist that the world is taking climate change seriously when it is actually paying companies and people to increase climate change. So that's a measure really of the challenge. and of the importance of this particular new initiative, which has gathered us together here today. As Gianni said, I've been working in this area for some time, and I set up and was the director of something called the UK Green Fiscal Commission. And over the 3 years of our activity, which was about 10 years ago now, you can see we commissioned a lot of, or we produced a lot of briefing papers on all the issues which routinely come up when you start talking about carbon pricing, to do with public opinion, to do with the modeling of the implications of a tax shift, to do with distributional issues, international comparisons, etc. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. We were very pleased when we finished our work that Canada set up its own eco-fiscal commission, very much on our model, and has also produced very interesting publication there, 10 Myths About Carbon Pricing. And both these commissions led to practical results, in the sense that 2 years after our commission did its work, the UK government introduced its own carbon support price, which is still in place and means that we now have an effective carbon price on the fossil fuel inputs into electricity generation, when you include the price of the EU emissions trading scheme, of about 50 euros per tonne of carbon. And that has been absolutely critical in driving coal out of our electricity generation mix. In Canada, of course, they have one of the most effective carbon prices in British Columbia, and the Eco-Fiscal Commission has been very much responsible for keeping that issue on the agenda at the federal level in Canada. So these were our conclusions from these 3 years' work on carbon pricing and environmental taxes more broadly. I can't go through them in the time that I have in any detail, but the briefing papers that I mentioned before go through these arguments in a lot of detail and provide the evidence for them. First of all, they work. They do reduce environmental impacts. That's what they're supposed to do, and they do. If you implement them in a revenue neutral way, as this organization is suggesting, then they can be economically beneficial. That particularly is the case if you use the revenues from carbon taxes to reduce in income taxes. And there's been a lot of modeling. We did some of our own modeling on that, and we were very much persuaded by the results that we got. They can raise stable revenues. Obviously, they won't raise stable revenues indefinitely, because by definition, when carbon, if we reach net zero in 2050, carbon taxes will not be raising much revenue. But if carbon emissions go down while carbon taxes go up, then over a period of some decades, carbon taxes can raise very useful revenues. And I think these are particularly useful in the context of developing countries, which find it difficult to raise revenues in other ways. The public can be won round to environmental tax reform. No one likes taxes, and sometimes people like green taxes less than other taxes. But we found in the public engagement work that we did with the Green Fiscal Commission that once the public understood what green taxes were for, and provided they could be persuaded that they didn't necessarily mean to an increase into the total tax burden, they could see the sense of taxing public bads rather than private goods, which is what we tend to do by taxing profits and wages. Environmental tax reform does stimulate investment in energy and environmental efficiency, and there's a lot of evidence on that, and in the low carbon industries of the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in my talk. It can mitigate the impact of high world fossil fuel prices by stimulating energy efficiency, and of low fossil fuel prices by including external costs. And at a time when fossil fuel prices are relatively low, that is a very good time to introduce carbon pricing, because it means that the price for the end consumer is much less obvious and noticeable and more affordable. The impacts on competitiveness can be mitigated. I was very glad to see mention by Attilio and the carbon border adjustments, which have been proposed as part of the European Green Deal. In my view, that is absolutely critical if we are to get especially the energy intensive trade exposed industries to pay for the externalities which they are producing. Of course, low carbon households need special arrangements. We know that low income households spend a higher proportion of their income on energy than other households, and they therefore need special arrangements. And by and large, those have been introduced when countries have introduced carbon pricing. And I would suggest green fiscal commissions. I wrote a book chapter for a book on carbon pricing on green fiscal commissions. There have been a lot of them, especially in European countries, and they have helped enormously in enabling publics to understand what the purpose of this mechanism is. So our lessons are that carbon taxes are not a magic bullet for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They need to be supplemented with regulations and with support for innovation, but they are an essential component of a cost-effective emissions reduction strategy. National and fiscal contexts are important for implementation. I've recently been a member of the Zero Carbon Commission in the UK, making sectorally specific recommendations for carbon pricing in my own country. But the general rules about good practice in public finance in respect of things like hypothecation still apply. The broad experience from carbon taxes can be read across to other environmental taxes and of course can be read across countries. And I was delighted that this World Carbon Pricing Initiative is going to be seeking to spread that experience from countries to countries, because my experience is that many countries are not fully aware of the potential of these initiatives. Gianni said that we've seen an enormous reduction in the costs of renewable energy. Here you've got the red lines for concentrated solar power, the yellow lines for PV, the gray line for onshore wind, and the darker gray line for offshore wind. And you can see that the cost reductions there over the last 10 years have been simply spectacular. No one, even people like me who've been working on this game for at least 30 years, was expecting that to happen. What this has meant is that the prices of all these technologies are now within the fossil fuel range, which is this darker shaded band here. And that means that carbon prices can have a really important effect in stimulating the take-up of those technologies. We're very familiar with the idea of carbon lock-in, that because of generations of investment in fossil fuel technologies, we are effectively locked into them at a societal level. We will need real incentives to get out of that lock-in. And here, just at the point when these renewable energy technologies are more or less cost competitive, a carbon price can make all the difference to push them over the line and to get private investors to invest in them. This diagram shows very much the same. It's not just renewable energy technologies that we need. We will need all the associated technologies that go with that. Here we see the enormous cost reduction in batteries that are going to be fundamentally important to getting electric vehicles rolled out in a mass deployment kind of way. And you can see there again that we're coming down to the general competitiveness level of fossil fuel technologies. And increasingly around the world, these renewable technologies are the cheapest technologies for power generation. And we can see there that sometimes it's wind, sometimes it's solar. And with these costs still falling, we can expect more and more countries to fall into these categories. And again, a world carbon price, not necessarily the same in each country, sectorally differentiated by all means, would provide a really powerful extra incentive for the take-up of these technologies. So I'm arriving at my conclusion now. Carbon pricing will accelerate the solar revolution, and in that I include wind as well. In addition to being an essential component of a cost-effective emissions reduction strategy, it will prevent investment in high carbon fuels and assets that could be stranded. And that's really important at this time of economic crisis, that we don't see enormous amounts of investments continuing to go into high carbon power generation, high carbon transport fuels, which over the next 10 years will not be able to be realized. We need to use all our investment in the maximally effective way for the transition to a low carbon future. And in many developing countries, a carbon price could prevent investment in infrastructure that will not be needed. And the poster child for this kind of leapfrogging in developing countries is, of course, telecommunications. Many of these countries will never invest in landlines, which were a huge investment that old industrial economies made. They've jumped straight to mobile technology, and many of them will not need to invest in national transmission infrastructure. They will be able to invest in a much more decentralized and devolved form of power generation. And the carbon price will help them to realize that, as well as generating some of the revenues which they will need to bring about that kind of transition. So thank you very much. That's all I've got to say, and I much look forward to your questions and the discussion from the panelists later in this event. Thank you very much. Gianni, back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ekins. Stay with us because there will be a very interesting debate later on. And your point regarding also not only the renewables, but also the associated technologies that really are very competitive is very important. And as you said, carbon pricing is an essential component of the decarbonization strategy. And you have been talking about possibility to generate stable revenues for the next decades. Well, we are targeting the 2050, and so carbon pricing can really support this very important time frame to reach our goal by 2050. And very good your point on the developing countries, and because when we put carbon pricing in the strategy, of course, we can avoid to make some mistakes in bad investments. Of course, we need to address properly the future investments. Thank you very much. So we give the floor to the next speaker, Jonas Teusch, economist, tax and environment unit, Center for Tax Policy and Administration from the OECD organization. So what rule for carbon pricing in a green recovery? Jonas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'll just start by sharing my screen. Excellent. Can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Good. So I have this big question, and I thought I would break it down to 7 somewhat more manageable questions before then answering the question, what role for carbon pricing and green recovery? I'll essentially double down on a lot of things that Professor Elkins said. Let me start with a basic question. What do we actually mean by carbon pricing? There are different ways governments price carbon. Typically, we look at the 2 main ways to do that intentionally. That would be through a carbon tax or through an emissions trading system. And when we take stock of what countries are doing, at the OECD, we typically take a broader approach. We also look at fuel excise taxes. And recently, we've also started looking more at fuel subsidies. These are not introduced with the intention of pricing carbon, but they do make fossil fuels either more expensive or cheaper in the case of the subsidy. So we think it's very useful to also look at these. And certainly when you think about a reform, maybe you can better align these pre-existing taxes also with the carbon content. How high are carbon prices? We generally look at OECD and G20 countries. And what we find in 2018, essentially 55% were still completely unpriced. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. And if we look at, say, a modest carbon pricing benchmark, I mean, ideas of how high prices should be differ quite a lot, also differ across countries. in terms of the appetite countries have to rely on pricing. But say Euro 30, we consider sort of a low-end benchmark, and there 83% in 2018 were not actually priced at a level that will reflect these climate costs. There has been some recent progress. If you look at ETS prices in the European Union right now, they are above Euro 30. So there are some promising developments. We've heard it before, carbon pricing is not the silver bullet. But there are certainly many opportunities to make better use of it. So it doesn't mean that we need to have a global carbon price that's uniform, but we can certainly make progress with carbon pricing across countries. If we don't do it, we are sort of missing out on some cheap abatement options, right? That was, I think, very clear in Professor Elkan's presentation. You have other tools and they're useful, but typically other tools, say an energy efficiency standard, doesn't encourage polluters or emitters to look for all sorts of ways to reduce emissions. So if we really want to make sure that emitters turn every stone to reduce emissions, adding a price to the policy mix or strengthening existing prices is very helpful. And we'll have new data coming out end of the month, and there's in parallel also new data on subsidies coming out the same day. How uniform are carbon prices across fuels and countries? Given that at the OECD we also include fuel excise taxes, which tend to mostly apply in road transport, you see that gasoline is typically taxed at the highest rate. That's not due to carbon taxes that are called carbon taxes. Then what we see also that coal is typically taxed at the lowest rates, right? That's unfortunate because coal does not only emit CO2, it also has a lot of local air pollution costs typically. So even also for non-climate reasons, there would make sense to tax coal more. You see here in the chart, there's the gray bar. This is a couple of developing countries we looked at recently. These typically price carbon at lower rates, but the patterns are also similar, right? So most of the taxes on fossil fuels continue to be fuel excise taxes that then mainly apply to road fuels. I mentioned that OECD and G20 generally have very low, still a lot of room for improvement. So you may think, well, if even the most advanced economies fall short, why should developing countries do more? And as Professor Elkan said, there are actually good reasons to do it out of domestic self-interest. We looked at these 15 countries in this report here. 1/3 of those didn't actually use any coal at the moment. So by getting incentives right now, you could avoid even investing in coal assets. And if we look at how much trouble many developed countries have at the moment to phase out coal, to deal with the transition in certain coal-producing regions, that's certainly something that's worth to avoid. There are also co-benefits. I mentioned local air pollution already. I also would like to stress that carbon pricing, unlike other climate policy tools, raises revenues. And in many developing countries, there's really a need to raise revenues to finance vital government services, very, very basic government services. So that's also a contribution carbon pricing can make. Another challenge in developing countries is informality. Generally, it's harder to avoid indirect taxes, such as fuel taxes or carbon taxes, than direct taxes on, say, labor or corporate income. So they can also help and provide incentives to reduce informality. And as such, then carbon pricing can really be making a contribution also to obtaining or to making progress towards the sustainable development goals. Is it difficult to price carbon? Well, politically, certainly yes, and I'll get back to that. But administratively, if you want to start, it can be very simple. Most countries that have a carbon tax, they have a fuel-based carbon tax. What does it mean? It's administratively done essentially the same way you would apply an excise tax, right? So you typically tax fuel suppliers or distributors or importers sometimes. So you have relatively few taxpayers. It's quite easy to do. And what you would have to do then essentially to align the tax rate, typically in commercial units, say liter for gasoline, with the carbon content. And I put some examples here for a Euro 30 benchmark. So that's not difficult, right? You can then later on, if you want to extend it to non-energy emissions, that's all fine. But if you want to start, it's fairly simple to get started. Revenues came up. I mentioned carbon pricing is different because it does raise revenues compared to other tools. We looked at the revenue potential. Naturally, that differs across countries. For these developing countries I mentioned, we said on average, we saw roughly revenue potential of a Euro 30 carbon tax of 1% of GDP. That differs quite a lot across countries, naturally, right? I mean, in oil exporting countries that are currently subsidizing fuel use, you may have much larger revenue potential, say in Ecuador. In others that presently hardly use any carbon and where you essentially avoid a lot of the carbon-intensive investments, you get less revenues, but you avoid future costs to taxpayers by reducing stranded assets. Then how should you use the revenues, right? One thing we do say is it's very important to be transparent about the revenue use, right? That's a general principle. However, we don't really endorse any particular form of revenue use. The best revenue use will often depend on the local circumstances. And so it's certainly very important to look at works best locally. What's the most productive revenue use locally? Naturally, political economy considerations will also play a role there, right? What can you do to make the reform palatable? But of course, another important issue, and that's may help you also with the political economy, is to make the reform progressive and make sure that vulnerable groups are better off, ideally, after the reform than before. So that's all something revenue use can help. So when we look at the sort of equity implications of carbon pricing, it's very important to keep in mind that there are revenues, and depending on how these are used, carbon pricing can be a very progressive policy choice. And I put in one example really to sort of hammer home the point is that tax and spending can really be implemented in tandem. And there was a recent example of the Irish budget where they raised the carbon tax by, I think, around 7 euros. And at the same time, they took several measures to boost the purchasing power of vulnerable groups and also invest in the just transition. So just one example for that. Now, I mentioned already, well, it may be administratively simple, certainly isn't politically simple or easy to make progress with carbon pricing. One issue was the distributional effects. Their revenue use can really help. Another issue is, of course, competitiveness, carbon leakage. At current price levels, we actually don't observe evidence of important adverse effects. But we should also be aware that at the moment, many of the carbon-intensive or the energy-intensive, trade-intensive sectors benefit from things like free allocation of emission permits. They may even be compensated for higher electricity prices. Or if it's a carbon tax, you may have preferential tax rates. The issue with these tools is that they tend to weaken abatement incentives. In ETS, free allocation, you preserve the incentive at the margin, but you may still distort investment incentives in favor of more carbon-intensive assets. So what happens now if governments move ahead, and if some governments raise carbon prices a lot while others don't, there could then still be an issue. And of course, that's being discussed. Maybe the most topical policy instrument in that sphere is the border carbon adjustment being discussed in the European Union. We had a paper on that came out in December. We looked at the trade-offs of different design choices. We don't endorse any particular design choice or any alternative, but we discuss these issues. So if someone's interested to have a look, economics there are quite straightforward, but doing it in practice is quite a lot more difficult. Another option, of course, if there are really issues with carbon leakage, is to coordinate on carbon prices. So I don't think a uniform global carbon price is within reach at all, right? If you wanted to do that, to be fair, you would need substantial fiscal transfers across countries. And if we look at how hard it is to agree on fiscal transfers within countries, often in federal systems, that doesn't really seem to be politically feasible. But what could be feasible is to maybe agree on sort of minimum carbon prices for certain sectors among like-minded countries, right? We see regional approaches, of course. Maybe the most famous one would be the European Union. And there are also some discussions that are interesting at the moment, whether maybe shipping could be included in the EU ETS. Now, to actually address the question I started with, naturally, we've seen a lot of countries exploring how to green their recovery policies. And there's a lot of focus on green spending, essentially governments, for instance, supporting energy efficiency investments, or maybe rolling out or helping with a rollout of, say, electric vehicle charging stations, etc. And these are certainly useful things to do potentially for the transition. But it would be important to also complement them with gradually increasing carbon pricing. Why is that? We need to mobilize both the private and the public sector to make all these investments. The public sector alone can't do it. And also governments have many other priorities. A big priority, of course, is our social priorities in the current situation to support people. And it's not realistic that all the support can be made conditional on green spending, right? You will have to just make sure that people then by themselves use this, the additional stimulus money in ways that are aligned with countries' long-term decarbonization objectives. And one way to do that is to have carbon prices in place. So that's a very useful tool to align also neutral stimulus with climate objectives. I talked a lot about carbon pricing, but I also want to take here the last slide of my presentation to talk a bit about things that governments can do beyond carbon pricing. And I mentioned that higher carbon prices would be useful, especially providing clarity going forward, right? Gradually increasing prices, ideally with a 2030 time horizon or even longer. Some countries are doing that. Netherlands, for instance, for industry and the power sector. Canada has started announcing trajectories up to 2030. But there are also some things governments can do that wouldn't involve raising prices, but maybe reducing taxes. And one issue is electricity tax reform. Typically, electricity taxes, they apply to all forms of electricity, no matter where it comes from. That means they make electricity more expensive. However, we also know that electrification is a very promising decarbonization strategy. So we may want to make sure, we know essentially how to decarbonize the power sector. So we want to make sure that electricity isn't too expensive, that we don't slow down the electrification process. So that would be, if governments wanted to reduce certain taxes, that would be one option where they could reduce taxes. If they're not comfortable with phasing out electricity completely, one could say suspending them until certain electrification targets have been met, or at least exempting clean electricity essentially from these taxes. And I think I'll stop here. There are some more specific ideas, but maybe I'll come back to them in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Very comprehensive presentation and complementary, I would say, to the Professor Ekins, as you really went to the details how to make revenues and underline that carbon price makes sense even more in the developing countries, because many people think the contrary, and supporting the green recovery. Very good link with the carbon pricing and the sustainable development goals. And yes, indeed, we need to apply a proper price. And anyway, a lot of even in areas where we have carbon price policies mechanism, actually is not many areas are not covered by a carbon pricing. So very good. So Jonas, stay with us for the roundtable later on. And I'd like to go to Europe now and introduce the next speaker, Hans Bergman, Head of Unit B1 ATS Policy Development and Auctioning, Director General Climate Action, European Commission. Mr. Bergman is going to give our perspectives of emission trade systems, carbon border adjustment mechanism, energy taxation, and in the European Union. Mr. Bergman, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this event. I'm afraid I don't have any slides, but I will speak and hopefully that will also give some information. So yeah, just to underline, since some of you are not from Europe, that the European Commission is like the executive branch of the European Union, and we are now 27 member states. And where I work, the DG Climate Action is like what you could maybe compare to a ministry in the country. And there I'm in charge of the ETS, the emissions trading system, and its policy development and its daily functioning also. So just to mention then that I will talk a bit about ETS, mainly about ETS, but a little bit on these other topics that you mentioned that are a bit more difficult because notably the CBAM is, it's just an idea so far. But ETS, already in 2003, we started to think in the EU, how can we, reach our climate targets? And there was attempts to introduce carbon taxation. It was for various different reasons difficult to agree on that in the EU. So instead came the proposal of a cap and trade system, what we call the emissions trading system. And it came into function in 2005. And basically it caps the emissions for half of all the emissions, half all the emissions in the EU from all the large installations, which are the power sector and the main energy intensive industries. When the system started in 2005, there was a lot of concern, as we have heard, about competitiveness and costs for industry and including for the power sector. So everybody got quite a nice share of free allocation in the beginning. And after some learning period in 2013, the system changed quite a lot. And for the power sector, it was, since we have a common European power market and no competition, more basically from outside, there was no free allocation. So the full impact of the carbon pricing on the power sector. So they have to buy all allowances they need for everything they emit. And for the industry, it was changed from say grandfathering system where the more industries emitted, the more free allowances they received, to a system based on benchmarks where each industry, well, let's say each sector had the benchmark. So the best installation in the sector would get more or less enough free allocation. But if somebody emitted maybe twice as much for the same ton of steel, for example, they would only have half the amount of allowances they needed. So create a stronger incentive also for industry to reduce emissions. The system worked on quite well. What we noticed after some years was that given that the reduction, we have this called cap, which is going down in a linear way until 2020 at the time, was legally fixed. When we had an economic crisis, there became a surplus, less emissions than we thought, so a surplus of allowances. And this created some problems, notably very low carbon prices and a bit of a lack in trust in the system. So there were some different ad hoc solutions to that, but then towards 2017, around there, we had agreed to something called the Market Stability Reserve, which is a system which sort of acts to ensure that if there's too many allowances in the system, we put some of it in the reserve and we will then auction less allowances. And since this system was adopted and started to come into force a couple of years ago, we have seen a very big increase in the confidence in the EU ETS and therefore also in the price, from being in the order of 10 euro, sometimes even less. We are now in the order of 40 euro carbon price now recently. And I can also note that although I think, for example, we have an annual reduction of the cap, which is in the order of 2%, we have a much bigger reduction of emissions. Still, the price is keeping up because people believe in the Market Stability Reserve, and also the market believes that the Commission will come with more strict and ambitious policies, which I will come to in a moment. So just to mention how it works very concretely, well, one thing I should mention is that since 2005, the emissions in ETS has gone down by about 35%. Last year, 2019, last year we had formal data was -9%, and for last year we have different analysts which have kind of guessed in the order of 20% reduction. A lot of it in the power sector, and as was mentioned many times now, thanks to the carbon price, coal is priced out of the merit curve. Just to mention, maybe interesting that we put out allowances in the market on a daily basis through auctions organized by EEX, which is an energy exchange. So, for example, just today I checked, we auctioned allowances for the value of 142 million euros, and most of this goes directly to the member state budgets. and they are supposed to use this money mainly, well, at least half of it for climate action. Many do use a larger share of that. Then we have a very big secondary market also of derivatives of this, which helps to create liquidity and help also the compliance buyers to hedge, etc. This market seems to be covering in the order of 1 billion euro per day. So it's a very big financial market we have also created. So we have a lot of responsibility also, not only on the climate side, but also on the financial side. Yeah, so we went now into, we have ETS in different phases. The third phase, 2013 to 2020, was when we changed from the free allocation system a lot. In 2021, now since January, we have a new system which has changed a little bit less than before, but it's now targeted to meet a 40% target for the EU as a whole. But as you may know, there was a proposal for a Green Deal where the new Commission came into force, and this included changing this 40% goal to 55%, and also at least 55%, and also reach climate neutrality by 2050. So there was a proposal, also promised that by June this year, we will come with legislative proposals to show how, from the Commission point of view, this can be achieved. And then this proposed legislation will then go to the member states, the Council, and the European Parliament, our two legislative bodies, to discuss and hopefully agree on more or less the lines. So what we are seeing is that we have to strengthen the ETS as we have it today. We also have to strengthen the different accompanying policies we have on energy efficiency, on renewable policy, renewable energy, on also rules about emission standards for new cars. We have a whole discussion of land use and land use change, which is always a sensitive issue. And we also have discussion now, possible extension of ETS to the two main sectors which are not covered, which is the road transport and the building heating sector. So we are looking at that and we are analyzing all the aspects to see if we will make a proposal on that. But the Commission already said it's likely to come such a proposal. On that later, of course, as we have heard from our previous speakers, the social aspects is very important because heating is a very important, of course, for everybody, and notably potential problem for lower income households, and also the road driving and etc. It's a sensitive issue, and one has to address that in one way or another. But as I said, the ETS already today generates a lot of revenues, and we can see if we would extend this ETS to these other two sectors, we could potentially generate even much more revenues that could be used in various ways to address social aspects, among others. There's also within the EU also the issue of social solidarity between poorer and richer member states, and that is also something that we discuss a lot. Maybe just to mention that since we are, well, quickly, that aviation and maritime are also two sectors that are, looked at. Aviation is already part of ETS, and maritime may well be. Coming back a bit to what was in my title, and it's this carbon CBAM. That's not, maybe everybody know what it means. Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's this idea that if we will go now even further in the EU with our climate policies and targets, although we have the free allocation, there's still a concern about industrial competitiveness and how to handle that, and also how to get the rest of the world as much as possible on board. So not, in the EU we reduce the emissions and others just profit from increasing. So I cannot say really very much. I can say that on this carbon border adjustment mechanism, there is we did a public consultation. There are different options, and well, there's certainly some sort of link to the ETS because the main issue with the competitiveness in this context is the ETS, and possibly start with a few sectors. There is constantly a discussion with industry about how to handle the issue of free allocation, because that's a system that industry knows and kind of works, but it's also something that one has to be mindful about, double two measures for the same purpose. On energy taxation, that's something we also have harmonized in the EU, but it's on a relatively low level. So most member states have, as we heard by OECD, also have higher energy taxes, notably on the road fuels, sometimes also on heating fuels. So there has been a discussion to have a carbon component in energy taxation, but let's see, there will be a proposal in June, and our colleagues are working on that. It's also something that I could maybe mention on the emissions trading system, the carbon pricing, is that we have a link now to the Switzerland, to their emissions trading system. There is a lot of international work and cooperation about emissions trading, as was mentioned by shown by this map also, and who knows if there would be more, global cooperation and linking, etc. The idea is in principle good, but it's also true that we learn from this work with linking the Switzerland that it's quite a lot to think about. It's not just 2-day work. It's many things to think of, and also how things move when one system changes or the other changes. When things are linked, you have to work very closely together with the different systems. That's something we are working on, we're learning from. But in conclusion, I think we can note that ETS now, with its increased price and increased credibility, I would say, from the financial market, but also from the whole, let's say, the renewable market, and those who need carbon pricing to get a better, investment calculus, with better incentives for doing investment. We can see it works, and we can also see that it is pricing in the short term, pricing out higher fossil fuels. In the longer term, hopefully helps investments in the right direction, and as was also mentioned, hopefully prevents some investments that are anyway would be not the right ones for the long term in fossil energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergman from the European Commission. Anyway, very good insight, also because Europe has a lot of experience, and thank you for giving also an overview of the history, of how we did arrive where we are now, and the perspectives. And anyway, of course, experience, and good to know that ATS for sure is generating revenues that can be spent in a social aspect, and indeed, as you said, covering other sectors like, of course, as you mentioned, transportation, heating. Anyway, when we talk about transportation, starting from aviation and maritime, which are segments that really are polluting a lot, is very important. Then, of course, we talk about emission trading systems. But of course, anyway, we'd like also to, as a worldwide carbon price, stimulate a debate between Europe, US, Asia, and other countries about, generally speaking, carbon pricing mechanism that anyway are reflected then in services and goods, which are also very important. Thank you very much for your presentation overview. We have of course, there's a lot to do by June, so good luck, and stay with us, because we jumped from Europe to US. So it's good to also to learn from the speakers that will follow what is happening with the new administration of Biden in US. And I'd like to introduce so the next speaker, Mark Afsted, fellow and director of the Carbon Pricing Initiative of the Resources for the Future, that is going to talk about the perspectives of the environmental transition in the US tax system. Mark, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen all right.
Yes, very well.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about perspectives from the US, and talk a little bit talk both about carbon pricing as well as some alternatives that the U.S. tax system could use to have an environmental transition. So just briefly, I'd like to just introduce my organization. So I work for Resources for the Future, and we're an independent nonprofit institution based in Washington, D.C. We are a non-advocacy organization, and we view ourselves as an objective think tank that's mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic vision and policy engagement. Most importantly, we do not take institutional positions on any public policy matters, whether in the U.S. or worldwide. Of course, as an individual, I can say as an economist that I think that carbon pricing is the policy that the U.S. should face or should take, but as an institution, that is not the position of our institution. So the RFF has a broad topic of studies besides carbon pricing. We have a social cost of carbon initiative, which has, in the last 4 years, has aimed to help improve the scientific basis of the discussion of social cost of carbon, while the Trump administration was not going forward with trying to update the scientific basis of those numbers. And we are hoping to work with the new administration in terms of coming up with new social cost of carbon numbers. And we have a number of other areas that we study quite a bit, if those are of interest for people. Under the carbon pricing initiative, I like to say that we have 3 main aims. Our first aim is what I like to call model development. And so we have a suite of economic models that we use to evaluate carbon pricing policies. So whether this is a sector specific electric power sector model, or a county-wide model of the US, or a regional model that allows us to look at impacts on state policies. We do these kind of developing these economic models, and then we deploy these models to do analysis to see what would happen if different policies were implemented. And then I think where RFF really stands in contrast to a lot of other organizations is not only we do just kind of like this kind of more academic research in terms of the development and deployment, we also do a lot of policymaker engagement. So we work directly with policymakers, and we hear what the issues they're thinking about, and that helps us steer where our research goes in terms of what issues are they thinking about, and where are the holes in our research, and where can we fill them going forward to help them make a case for their policies. And this has been particularly true in terms of carbon pricing. So in the previous Congress, the 116th Congress, between 2019 and 2020, there were 9 carbon pricing proposals. So one of the things we did is we introduced a carbon pricing bill tracker, which is on the RFF website. And so this compares for each bill what the carbon price that was introduced looks like in terms of, say, the initial tax, the annual adjustments, what year it would start in. And we've talked a lot about revenue use already today from some of the other speakers. And certainly this is a very big deal in terms of the distributional consequences of the policy. And then one thing that I'm particularly proud of is in the US, there's been a big push from environmental groups for what they call this thing called an environmental integrity mechanism, which is this idea that a carbon tax can't guarantee emissions outcomes. It can guarantee a price, but it can't guarantee emissions outcomes. Whereas a cap and trade program can guarantee an emissions outcome, but it can't guarantee a price outcome. So cap and trade bills deal with this by, or cap and trade programs deal with this by introducing price ceilings or price floors or emissions containment reserves. A carbon tax, previously people haven't thought of this, and so we came up with the idea of this automatic adjustment mechanism, which would allow the carbon tax to adjust annually if emissions in the previous year had not met the target. And so these different bills have different types of automatic adjustment mechanisms. This is an idea that really some of our research at RFF really helped inform. And so one of the things you'll see here across these different carbon pricing proposals is that the starting point and the rate of increase differ quite a bit. So there's some bills that want to start low and increase at a very high rate, where there are some bills that want to start at a higher rate and increase maybe at a lower rate. And so you can kind of see, even in this basic table here, that kind of where some of the consensus on what a carbon pricing proposal could look like in the US and where some of the differences were. And so these are some of the differences that still need to be discussed. So we have a data tool at RFF for US carbon pricing proposals, and we call it the Carbon Pricing Calculator. And I advise all of you guys to go there and visit it. I don't have time to go through all the details of the calculator, but for each carbon pricing proposal, it shows projected emissions reductions for each proposal, shows projected impacts on GDP. It shows projected distributional impacts, so impacts across different income groups and also across states, and also income groups within a state. And so you can really see how these different revenue use proposals can affect the distributional impact. So what I mean is whether or not low-income households are adversely affected or not. It can show how much revenue is going to be raised, and how much prices are going to be increased. And so it's a really cool tool. I'm very proud of it. And so I think this is a good summary. If you visited this, it's a good way of looking at how we think that carbon pricing could affect the US. I'd also just like to say that we have a carbon pricing explainer series that we've been working on over the past year, that kind of starts at kind of a basic level and then goes more in depth across different sectors. And so already we've talked today about how important revenue use is. So we discussed in the US context how important revenue use is in our carbon pricing 102. We've talked about how different sectors are affected differently. So in the US at least, the power sector is the sector that we expect to be the most responsive to carbon pricing, whereas we think the transportation sector is going to be the least responsive to carbon pricing, at least in the near term. And so we talked about that in the carbon pricing 103 and the 201 and 202. Looking at the distributional effects, we look at that in the 104 explainer. One thing I haven't seen a lot of talk about today is the fact that carbon pricing also not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but it also reduces local air pollutants. And in the US, the value of the reduced local air pollutants may be as great as the value of the reduced carbon dioxide emissions. So it's a very significant aspect of carbon pricing, at least in the US. And so we talk about it there. And so I'd advise everyone to check out these different explainers to go through all these details. So now for the kind of the main piece of my my talk here for the next 5 to 7 minutes, and then I'll wrap up, is what is the political feasibility of carbon pricing in the US versus the political feasibility of other policies in the current Congress with Biden administration. So for those who aren't familiar with US politics currently, the Senate is where climate policy will live or die. The House is Democratic and will pass most pieces of climate policy legislation. The Senate, with a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans, means that any climate package will probably require reconciliation. For those who are not aware, reconciliation is an arcane Senate rule which allows for budget-related bills to pass with a simple majority rather than having to go through the filibuster, which would require 60 votes. So the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill that was signed into law last week passed through reconciliation, with a simple majority. And so Vice President Harris actually cast the deciding vote if it's 50-50, and she did that time. Now with climate package, it's a little bit more complicated than the COVID package because we have a senator from West Virginia who's a Democrat named Joe Manchin. And Joe Manchin is, he famously in a campaign for running for Senate in 2010, shot a carbon pricing bill with a shotgun in a video. So his support is not guaranteed for carbon pricing, and his support will be needed unless the bill can receive Republican support. Now, Republicans, there are a few Republicans who are not against carbon pricing. The people on the record are Senator Murkowski from Alaska and Senator Romney from Utah. However, reconciliation is a very political type of process. So I think it's going to be very hard under reconciliation for any Republicans across the aisle to support a climate policy, even if they would have supported that policy if it would have gone through a more normal process. The other thing I would say is that Democratic enthusiasm for carbon pricing continues to decline. Bernie Sanders famously endorsed a carbon pricing policy in his 2016 presidential campaign for the Democratic nomination. However, now he's the sponsor of the Green New Deal, which is says very little about carbon pricing. The Clean Future Act, which was introduced by climate hawks in the House, including Representative Tonko from New York, who's been very much leading carbon price or climate policy in the House, introduced the Clean Future Act, which features a number of policies, but not carbon pricing. And so this is very much a sector by sector specific approach. There's one policy for the power sector, which would be a clean energy standard. There's one policy that is for the transportation sector, which is more infrastructure investment in EV charging stations, et cetera. One of the other things that why Democratic enthusiasm for carbon pricing continues to decline is that there are significant concerns from the environmental justice community over carbon pricing. The idea here is that carbon pricing will allow local air pollutants to continue to be released in poor communities, whereas the bulk of the reductions in these local air pollutants I talked about will occur in wealthier neighborhoods. I personally think that these concerns are overblown. A vast majority of the local air pollutants today that are released in the US are in environmental justice communities. And carbon price is going to reduce those emissions. And so I personally think that those reductions are going to occur in those communities, and those communities will be better off from a local air pollution point of view. But there is a significant concern among the EJ community in the US about this. And so I think I think where we need to go with this is we need to show specific geographical maps about where we expect the local air pollutants to be reduced, to show these groups and these communities that their concerns are over carbon pricing are not valid. And so in light of the decline in enthusiasm for carbon pricing, alternative climate policies continue to garner more support. And so what are these different policies? So in the power sector, the clean energy standard is definitely a policy that is seeing a lot of talk. People are talking about this a lot. Of course, there's a policy that's going to support solar. But it's a policy that's not going to drive decarbonization in, say, the industrial sector or the transportation sector, which we know are the harder to decarbonize sectors already. And so the other thing is that a clean energy standard is a policy that's going to be very hard to pass through reconciliation. It would have to be contorted in a number of ways in a way that would not look, the policy that would be passed would not look like what we normally as economists think is a clean energy standard to satisfy the reconciliation rules. So that's maybe a reason why clean energy standards maybe don't have a political chance this Congress is because passing it through reconciliation would be hard. But there are a lot of proponents in the US who are proposing trying to pass clean energy standards through reconciliation. The other thing I think the other policies that are continuing to garner more support are revisions to investment and production tax credits. And so these are extending the tax credits and also increasing the tax credits. And so I think the other thing is making sure that each generator has the opportunity to choose whether or not they want an investment tax credit or a production tax credit. I've seen some research recently which shows that solar generators would actually, in the long run, prefer the production tax credits as opposed to the investment tax credits, whereas wind would prefer the investment tax credits. And so making sure that each industry is able to choose the tax credit that is most rewarding to them would allow each industry to grow as best they could. And of course, there's always ideas of hybrid policies. So there could be a policy that has production tax credits, investment tax credits, and extensions, maybe a very moderate carbon price with a clean energy standard on top of that. These are all kind of floating through the air here in the US, in Washington, DC, as ideas. But I think it remains to be seen whether or not any of these policies have can pass through the Senate. And I think the other thing I would say is that while the Biden administration has not come out opposed to carbon pricing, it hasn't come out and fully embraced carbon pricing. So, for example, Janet Yellen is the US Treasury Secretary. She is a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council, which is a group that promotes a carbon tax and dividend approach in the US. She's been kind of at the forefront of being for carbon pricing, but a lot of the other people that the Biden administration has appointed to positions are less enthusiastic about carbon pricing. So it's without the Biden administration making clear declarations of support for carbon pricing, it's hard to see how carbon pricing will be the main climate policy. It's possible that it could be a smaller climate policy. It could be a piece of the climate policy puzzle, but I think it's hard to see right now how a carbon price could be the primary or only climate policy being passed at this time in the US. So with that, I think I will conclude and we can move on to our discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark Asted of Resource for the Future. Thank you for this insight on the new administration of Biden. At least, anyway, the good news that the topics on the table due to the direction of the Biden administration on anyway approaching, of course, a clean energy strategy for the United States, and for sure I think it could be, as the pandemic is a global phenomena and the crisis global, will be very important to try to work as anyway all together. Worldwide Carbon Price will try to collect the point of view and let anyway different governments share best practice. I think we need to work a lot in order to prepare a COP26 that maybe will be so important, if not even more than the COP21, and where all governments will meet on this topic. And yes, indeed, it's very important to talk not only about emissions, but the quality of air. It's a very important approach that I'm sure many other speakers present here support. So thank you very much. And we jump to the roundtable, and I'd like to introduce Michele Governatori, which is the coordinator of the scientific committee of Worldwide Carbon Price, and we have other guests from Asia, and of course Stefan Sincher from Can International. The floor is yours, Michele, and yes, I will come back for the final conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. Good afternoon, everybody. From my side too, I'd like to thank especially the members of the scientific committee for contributing to this agenda. Actually, we could not accommodate all the speakers that we had the chance to reach, and I want to apologize about this, especially with Min Lee and Stephen Singer, and would like to give the floor now for 5 minutes or what you need. We don't have much time, to Min Lee, Chief Representative for China for International Emission Trading Association. I don't think Ms. Lee has a slide, but my maybe trivial question is, we've seen that the Chinese administration has set goals quite ambitious of carbon neutrality, if I'm not mistaken, by 2060. What role will carbon price or emission trading schemes play about that, mainly?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation of the host, and also I'm really happy to see like there are more and more organizations, international organizations promoting carbon pricing mechanism. Because as you mentioned, like IETA, International Emissions Trading Association, that I'm representing in China, is one of the earliest international organizations with the sole purpose to really to establish an international framework for trading greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I guess like officials from EC DG Klima knows IETA pretty well, because my colleagues, and they have been very close communicating with the DG Klima, and we have really worked out a lot of position papers there. But well, that's not my contribution, but I'm more focused on China. Yeah, as yes, it's true, like China has been again, and also continues to have the attention and catch the attention global wide to see how we really meet our 2 goals, which is announced by our president in September last year, 2020, is to reach our carbon emission peak earlier than 2030, and also to achieve carbon neutrality earlier than 2060. And for these 2 targets is marking actually the 3rd historic moment for how carbon pricing mechanism is introduced into China. And well, the first phase, I can go quickly a little bit back of the history. Like there is no clear, strong debate between carbon tax or a trading system, because that is like around the CDM period of time is when Kyoto Protocol came into effect after 1997, and China was the largest provider of offset CR projects to EU ETS, and that's the first time of period when carbon emissions trading system is introduced to China. And then later on to 2015, we come to another historic moment. It's also when our president, after he signed the Paris Agreement, and he made also the announcement, like China, we're going to build a nationwide ETS system. So that's also a promise to have a nationwide carbon market. Why he's very confident to make the announcement is just because after CDM period, and then we have like immediately coming to domestic carbon market to establish and set up our regional ETS pilot. Around till now, we do have still 9 pilots going on. And since 2013, we have gained experience in really establishing ETS system in the city and also in the provincial wide, and covering multiple sectors and also different types of greenhouse gases, not only CO2. And then the 3rd moment is the year, last year, when our president announced the enhanced ambitions of our NDC contribution is really to lock down the time to peak our emission and also really reach net zero, which is give us less than 30 years. And for now, we do could see like from this year on, 2021 is the first year of our 14th five-year plan. So this in the following 5 years, which will be very crucial for the whole nation to firstly to really to develop and formulate our action plan to reach peak carbon dioxide emission. And this will be like already announced as the key tasks to the central and also local provincial governments. And meanwhile, in order to really serve to the peak carbon dioxide emission, carbon market ETS will serve the leading role. It will be the most effective mechanism to assist covered entities to really meet the goal. For now, for the national ETS, 2021 will be the actual first year in operation, because we heard a lot in the previous years. In the past 4 years, there are a lot of preparations since Kyoto Paris Agreement can come into force, and the whole country is busy and gasping and all the preparation, set up a legislation framework and also the relevant management measures which are required. And this year we do have more positive news and from our like central government and which have highlighted the actions and to facilitate really the actual concrete steps for the national carbon market, as well as to, because for the, as if you follow the national Chinese ETS, for national ETS, we only covered the power sector in the first phase, which is like, till now we have around more than 2,200 power entities will be included into the national ETS. And we do have 9 ETS pilots in different provinces and cities are still ongoing. And for the market scale of the ETS pilots, till the end of February, we do have a market trading volume more than 400 million tons, and with the turnover of around $1 billion US. That is our pilots, ETS pilots. Well, for the national ETS, in the first phase, we can see that like it's only cover all the power sector, and it is the expectation the expanded coverage will be will open to other sectors by hopefully by end of next second year, and then we'll also include other greenhouse gases, and it will be more diversified. So this is this is for like compliance market. However, we do see the contribution how to really reach carbon neutrality. Offset is also very important complementary to the market. And for offset, I guess like renewable energy will contribute a lot, because we do see the increase of the market demand. Like for solar PV will be like around annual. You can imagine to reach the neutrality goal by early than 2060. The market demand will have more than 700 gigawatts, even for just pure solar PV. So it will be a huge demand and increase of renewable energy as well. And these are all set in our national target for energy transition, and also for the low carbonization of different sectors, and to achieve the low carbon green economy, green and circular economy development. Yeah, I think that I firstly stop here.
Thanks a lot. Quite an impressive program, actually. Okay, now we have Stefan Singer. I know that Stefan will probably bring his critical view on some of the points we've covered. I think Stefan also has one slide. Please, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I cannot share the screen. It tells me someone else is sharing screens.
Fine. I'm sure we can help you. Great.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Well, Climate Action Network International is representing about 1,500 NGOs worldwide. We are in 130 countries at least. We are bottom up. We are governed by non-governmental organizations. We are not reporting to governments and to industries, and we're arguably the largest environmental network worldwide. I want to say that. So we try to be in little bits in defining, addressing, and announcing the voice of those who are representing environmental NGOs, development NGOs, climate justice groups, social justice group, human rights groups, etc., which is, for me, being in a secretariat, a little bit a job like herding cats, but that's the way it is, and it's a good job. So key principles on carbon taxes for 1.5C, because I think that's what we want to achieve. I think that's the overall objective and the goal, and we should never lose that out of our mind. First thing is for us that we have talked about this a lot internally and with other people, and have listened to many experts. A globally unified carbon tax does not work. I think we have seen the call for a global carbon tax, in particular by fossil fuel companies across the world, in order to stop any kind of action on climate change, because a global carbon tax will not be agreeable worldwide. It will be unjust and unfair, because power purchase parities, income discrepancies are across the world a given, and so we need to have much more tailor-made approaches. What we would need in terms of carbon taxes is towards the 1.5C trajectory and the rest, the renewable energy revolution, which we need. We are far away from that one still, I must say. Sectoral and tailor-made carbon energy taxes, nationally or regionally, could be internationally, could be within Europe, could be within regions of countries, but they should address the highly different abatement costs according to different sectors. A carbon price in the power sector, a low carbon price in the power sector might have different implications than it might have in the building sector or the transport sector. Let's keep that in mind. And I'm coming back to the equity issues in a minute. A credible European trading system, and I subsume now a European and an emission trading system under carbon taxes, needs to have permit prices with up to €80 to 150 per ton of CO2 to address the external costs, which address the damage of climate change and which address also air pollution, which is currently killing from fossil fuels, killing more than 8 million people annually. New research coming out a couple of weeks ago by the Harvard University, and the current carbon prices, though going up in the ETS and the European ETS, do not reflect fully the external costs, which we would need to have this fundamental change we need. On top of that one, all is nothing for us without sectoral targets, standards, including energy efficiency and targets for renewable energy sources, including solar. Because a carbon price per se does not necessarily deliver what we need unless we have the overlying targets. I said, I think in the beginning when we had the introduction, I said you have the situation that rich people, wealthy people can still buy SUVs. They might complain about the high fuel prices because of carbon taxes, but they will drive their high fuel consuming cars, whereas the poor cannot do that one. That's why we need standards, energy efficiency limits and fuel limits. I think that very much needs to go together in terms of equity and in terms of fair treatment of everyone, because we do not want the rich to just pay the price for keep on polluting. That would be unjust. There was a debate people are having, and Johnny, we also had a little bit of discussion about this one, as to what extent carbon border tax adjustments or a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBM, which are currently being debated in Europe, will play a fundamentally good role to promote renewables and promote the move to less fossil fuels. They might turn out, I don't think that the verdict is out, but they might turn out to be counterproductive. They might turn out. So in our network, there is no common position that we like it or we don't like it. Some like it, some don't. Some are, as myself, we're just visiting it, we're just observing it, and we are neutral, and we wait for better understanding. So just to address those people who are more critical, it might create national fortresses. It might create national free allocations in emission trading systems, because it will be used by industries to say, listen guys, if you already accept that there are carbon border tax adjustments necessary, that means we already are suffering from competitive issues, we're already disadvantaged. So give us free allocations under whatever emission trading systems, which would provide not a good productive debate. And we all know, and I learned with pleasure from the OECD presentation, that there is currently no evidence that there is a kind of over allocation and a kind of how shall I say, lack of competitiveness being caused, or failure of competitiveness being caused by emission trading systems. It might create on a different thing, a new boundary for developing country products. I think we need to be aware of that one, that we do not want developing countries, in particular from poorer countries like Africa, Asia, from the LDCs, to suffer from short-term income possibilities for products which might be higher in carbon, but overall do not contribute significantly to emissions and to climate change, because there are other pockets of wealth, pockets of richness, which are much bigger. I think it's a solidarity issue, but we have to be very careful in terms of equity and to take that into account. Another issue comes from my colleagues. So why would we start with carbon? And why don't we talk about energy consumption or human rights? I give you the example. People are saying, yes, of course, we need to be lower in carbon, but why would we have, for instance, if we would tax a product on carbon and not on energy consumption, that would mean that we would preferably support countries or companies which have an electricity or energy consumption for their products, which is based a lot on nuclear energy, right? They're low in carbon, but they have lots of other legacies, lots of other environmental legacies. So we shouldn't do that. Human rights. There's an ongoing debate coming up, guys. I tell you, it's coming up on the footprint of rare earths, the footprint of essential metals for generating renewable energies, but in particular batteries. We see human rights violations. We see significant environmental impacts of mining rare earths, which need to be overcome to some extent. It's China, it's South America, it's Africa. It's a couple of products, rare earths, it's molybdenum, it's cobalt, etc., it's lithium in particular. So we need to address that one. So if we do a proper assessment of impacts on the environment of products which are coming in or going out of any regions, then we need to then we might have to have a more comprehensive view. The other thing is what people are saying, what we might, if we go for carbon or we go for carbon border tax adjustments, we might step into a kind of, although not wanted, in a kind of Trumpist behavior. We might generate overall international trade disputes, which we do not want, because we want people to trade equally, to trade fairly, etc., etc. I know we are far from that one, but having no trade at all based on certain limitations might not be the way out. How do we deal with verification, monitoring, and compliance rules for any carbon border tax adjustments? Open questions. Who's deciding on it? What are the products, the processes we would include? Based on which criteria? So what we would say is we would need instead now, I'm not saying we would rule out carbon border tax adjustments forever. We're not saying that one. We need to promote the best standard productions instead, which includes international products. So I mean, if we have, let's say in Europe, where this is currently being discussed, carbon border tax adjustments within the Green Deal, companies should be asked, or let's say governments should put forward the request for the best available standards. And then the product is being chosen. And regardless whether it's coming from inside Europe or outside Europe, there might be products coming from outside Europe, and there are products that are coming from outside Europe, which are much better than products coming from inside Europe. Not only with regard to carbon, but also with regard to labor standards, to human rights, to energy consumption, etc., and vice versa. So I think that's the way we need to go, which is a little bit more of a granular a little bit more of a more detailed approach, but I think it's more just and it's more fair. And other thing is for energy intensive industries, I think those are the sectors which are probably targeted with carbon border tax adjustments. We might looking into sectoral and global agreements on standards. Giving you an example, we see currently that the steel sector is thankfully and gratefully looking into replacing coke and coal with renewable hydrogen. That's a great move. We are not there yet. It's not commercially available. Couple of countries and couple of companies have started to work on that one in India, in Sweden, in Austria, in Germany, a couple of other countries. So why don't we make that standard that where we would say as governments, or as people would say, we would like public procurement of our governments to be based on those standards. And again, regardless where they're coming from, but based on best standards. And I think that's the way forward at this point in time. Again, we're not ruling out carbon border tax adjustments in the future. They might be necessary at some point in time, but currently we do not see that this is productive or helpful. There might be other ways forward, which might be much more promising. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Well, yeah, I think we do like civil rights here, but it's not within the scope of our organization and what we're trying to do in this webinar. Anyway, I take one of your many points, critical points, which is the one about developing countries, because it's also been raised in a question in the Q&A session. By the way, I ask the audience and the speakers to be patient for 10 minutes more in order we can accommodate those questions. So I would like to ask Jonas Teusch, because he mentioned that in his presentation, and I've read the same paper mentioned by Stefan. So Jonas, is carbon pricing something suitable for rich countries only?
Thank you, Michele. No, I think because there are two questions around that, right? Do we need a uniform carbon price across all countries? No, but can even relatively low carbon prices make a lot of sense for developing countries themselves, even say ignoring the emission reduction benefits? Then yes, they can make a lot of sense. And I think higher carbon prices in developed countries, they will of course also help to bring technology costs down. We saw some very impressive examples of solar costs that came down, right? So then even at very low carbon price and sometimes even at no carbon prices, you get actually a renewable power that's much cheaper than whatever other option you have. So you can bring costs down in the developed world as well. Then importantly, you keep the trade channel open, that these clean technologies actually can travel freely to across the world. And then in the developing countries with small prices, you can do a lot. You can raise revenues that can be very, very useful, and you can make sure that you get the right investments now, right? So often you have much fewer legacy assets that are carbon intensive, so you can avoid creating such assets in the first place. So you avoid stranded assets, and it's not only about the assets, it's also about the skills that you avoid. You avoid investing in skills that won't be needed anymore. So you avoid a lot of the transition costs. So I think it's certainly very useful also in the developing world.
Thank you, Jonas. I know that Mr. Beckman needs to leave, so I'd like to address a question explicitly for him if he is still with us. The question is, what role do you think the developments of the European carbon pricing, the ETS, and also the carbon border adjustment mechanism will play in terms of strengthening the European integration of tax policies within the EU, Mr. Bergman?
Well, that's a quite difficult question because you know, EU countries collaborate on many things, and there's this rule that, for example, on climate policies we have what we call majority voting. So, you know, although we always try to get all member states along on all legislation, it's not you know, one member state cannot stop it. But for taxation, it's more sensitive. So member states have this veto right. So that's why it was always more difficult to get taxation legislation through. So it's difficult to say, but we have this, as I said, minimum energy taxes, for example, that are in general higher, but sometimes some member states have this. If we would come now with, for example, well, there's already discussion, I think, in some member states on the combination of, let's say, what you pay for the ETS and national taxes, and if there would be a proposal for extending the ETS to road transport and heating fuels, that would maybe, especially for road transport, would probably generate a debate in some member states about the national taxation and how does that fit together with the possible European ETS for the same fuel. Now, I think it's not impossible that we can have, there's usually already tax and TVA on the same fuels, and it's not impossible to have different instruments for the same thing. We also have energy efficiency policies on top of ETS, etc. But let's see, the debate will be there. I still think that member states are very keen on their taxation, the right to somehow have the last word when it comes to what we call purely taxation.
Thanks, Mr. Bergman, and thanks also for mentioning the job to be done within the EU in terms of energy and energy taxation. I'd like to mention a recent work by Michael Pall, who is also a member of the scientific committee, about the extension of the emission trading system in Germany, which might be a case of study for the European Union as a whole. And before turning back to Professor Ekins, I'd like to ask Mark Afsed about something that that John Kerry, if I'm not mistaken, declared. So he made recently a critical declaration about the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism by the European Union. So I would like to ask you, do you think this is something we should be worried about, or it is a good sign that the proposal by the European Union is raising a global discussion about carbon pricing and possibly triggering a positive answer from the US in terms of doing something similar? Mark.
Thank you. So I'm an economist and I'm not a politician or anything like this. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm certainly not privy to the administration's conversations on this. I would say my initial reaction to John Kerry's message was that it is actually that the European Union's actions are raising concern among trading partners. And so I think it's more the latter of what you said, that this is causing conversation. I'm not sure yet whether or not this will cause policy actions by any trading partners, but it's certainly, it's certainly enough to worry trading partners. I'll say on the flip side, though, the Biden administration has proposed a carbon pricing border adjustment in the absence of a carbon price in the US. And so this would be basically placing a carbon price on imports into the US. And whether or not this is actually WTO compatible is certainly open for question. I'm no WTO lawyer or expert, but the US has talked about this as well even in the absence of our own policies. So I think these are going to be interesting conversations, and I think we just need to see where the conversations go before we can make them more, before we can say more.
Can I come in with one sentence here?
Sure, Stefan. Go ahead.
I think the interesting thing with the US is here that the United States of America has one of the most inefficient energy intensive, carbon intensive sectors: steel, chemicals, cement, etc., not because they are so bad, but because the plants are old, right? And many developing countries have much higher energy efficiency and carbon efficiency, simply not because they're better, but because the plants are younger, right? That's a normal trend of innovation and modernization. So if Europe or the US come to the idea to do carbon border tax adjustments for some of those products, they will realize, oh shit, our products are less efficient at those from some of these countries, not from all of them, right? But that's basically because these countries like India, China, South Africa, Brazil, etc., and Indonesia have started to develop the energy intensive industries 30, 40 years ago, not much before. Whereas we have in Germany, I'm German, we have a large company, ThyssenKrupp steel company. They still work on boilers which are almost 80 years old, right? So that's one issue. And they compete with Tata, with Terry from India, which are much younger, and they have better steel. That was my point. If we go for carbon border tax adjustment, we should go both ways. We should say then we should give preferential treatment for those products which are much more efficient, much less carbon intensive, right? But that's not what's being discussed. It's only discussed in one way. Let's protect our borders. Let's protect our industries. And that's the wrong discussion.
That's clear, Stefan. Good point. I'm more optimistic than you are about what will be triggered by the CBAM. Anyway, we are short of time. I'd like to close my part with a last question to Professor Atkins. I was, Professor Atkins, very impressed by how strong was your statement that we're seeing a colossal market failure. So this economic point of view of what's happening to the climate. I'd like to ask you a last statement on that before giving back the chair to Gianni. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thanks, Michele. Yeah, I mean, that wasn't my statement. That was the statement by Nick Stern, that it's the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. And this was in his, I think, landmark report on the economics of climate change from 2006. And what we know is that if there was the colossal market failure then, it's an even bigger market failure now, because the temperatures have gone up. And as we know, the social cost of carbon rises over time. So the traditional economic approach to externalities is to try to price the activity. And I think I was fascinated by Mark's mechanism whereby you try to get the best of both worlds in terms of both adjusting the price and the quantity in order to meet the environmental target. It's a kind of combination of the standards pricing approach and the externality pricing. So, yeah, I mean, it is well known that if you have an externality, it means you will be consuming more of the product than you should be consuming for human welfare reasons. I mean, these are not, there's nothing ideological about this. This is about human welfare. And when you add the carbon externality to the local pollution externality, which I think, as someone said, is leading to the premature death of something between 5 and 9 million people per year, we get terribly excited about COVID. COVID hasn't killed anything like that number. And yet from local air pollution, we're happy to accept the deaths of 5 to 9 million people per year, simply because we don't price these fossil fuels properly. So that, I think, is what I mean by the externalities. I mean, if you look at the IMF, they have actually costed these externalities of fossil fuels, including the local air pollution costs, and come up with the staggering sum of some $5 trillion. $5 trillion. Well, that makes the, you know, some of these stimulus packages pale into, make them seem relatively insignificant. And yet we put up with that every year. Every year we just allow that to go on, and we lose these lives, and we lose these health consequences, and we're losing our climate stability. So when I think then in terms of the greatest market failure the world has ever seen, I kind of think this is a bit of an underestimate.
I totally share your point, Professor Atkins. Thanks a lot. Gianni. Gianni, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Michele. Thank you very much, all speakers. I think there is no conclusion because in reality, was a very good starting roundtable about the debate that we will continue this year about carbon pricing. And the Worldwide Carbon Price is the initiative that want to embrace all actors that want to debate and push, move on about a worldwide carbon price that works. And for sure, anyway, everybody agree on the fact that carbon price would accelerate solar renewable deployment. And of course, is an essential component, as a professor, as was said, I think by Professor Ekins, of the climate strategy to reach the 2050 decarbonization. And for sure, we cannot talk about carbon pricing while we continue subsidizing the fossil fuels. So for sure, carbon pricing could stimulate investment in the green energy sources. So I invite all of you to continue following us. We have placed in the chat a survey also about how the industry is living this moment and what's the opinion of the industry on the green recovery plans. Global Solar Council will have a next webinar where we'll disclose the result of the survey on the 6th of May. Will be a 1 year time, an overview about the scenarios after the pandemic. Last year, we had guests like La Camera, Mr. La Camera, Director General of IRENA, and Jeffrey Sachs, the consultant of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And but for sure, worldwide carbon price and Global Solar Council will continue with the others members and anyway, and with all of you to build one message for the one with strong voice for the COP26 will be very important. So a lot of other meetings and webinars will follow. And thank you very much. I think we did bring on the table very high-level experts from all over the world. And so everything will be recorded. The presentation will be available on the website of Worldwide Carbon Price and of Global Solar Council. And thank you very much. I think we can conclude this session. Thank you for all the people that have been helping organize this webinar. And thank you to all speakers and to all the participants. Thank you very much. Bye.